Are we going to be able to see everybody or just panelists?
Panelists.
Just panelists, cool. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Hello, hello.
Abby, I am just going to invite you to every single of these ones as a panelist. Thank you for doing this. You can probably see folks come in. We're so happy you're here. Welcome. This is MTI Live number 10. And while folks come in, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing here. My name is Diane Buis, here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm the director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live number 10 of our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of the Accelerator program that runs for 4 months, June through October. So we're towards the tail end for the 104 companies that are across our 3 cohorts in the 2023 program. Specifically, the US program has 61 companies, and they will have a chance to do private Q&A with our panelists in about an hour. But if you're joining us on the live stream, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator for medical devices and healthcare IT in the world. It's a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but we're looking for people with companies that are up and running, have teams, prototypes, and early evidence that the technology works. And then we partner them with experts in the industry, strategics and others, to help them bring that product as quickly and efficiently to the market with as much value as possible. And we're opening these webinars up to the broader ecosystem beyond the cohort. So if you're on this live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat on LinkedIn or YouTube, and our team will feed them to me. I can feed them to our panelists if they are within the topic range that we're currently talking about. With that, it is my real pleasure to convene this panel today. I would say every startup everywhere always wants to talk to investors. And the question is even what different types of investors, who is the type of investor I should talk to? Where lie the bigger differences between strategics and venture capitalists? And those are some of the broader topics we want to explore today with you. It's a real pleasure to have Abigail Hunter-Sayed with us, as well as John Perez and June John. And I will give each of them in turn an opportunity to introduce themselves and their work so that you can get a better idea of where they fall on the spectrum of venture capital versus corporate venture capital. Abby, can I have you start telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, thank you so much for having me here. It's such a privilege. You guys run such an incredible program. 104 companies, did you say, across all the geographies? That's amazing.
104.
And it's such our pleasure to be working with MTI at Olympus Innovation Ventures. I come from a background as a founder myself, and then as a business operator, and finally kind of mistakenly landing into the VC space, where I've been on both sides of the table, both as an institutional VC, where I was a partner at an early stage pre-seed and seed stage deep tech funds, before moving over to Olympus Innovation Ventures, where we now invest in early stage companies that are building medical devices, diagnostics, and digital health. We look at companies between usually around like seed or Series A, all the way up to Series C, Series D if we need to. Writing checks in order to help them succeed, to connect them in with the Olympus network and expertise across all of the clinical areas where we practice.
And I've definitely heard great things from some of the companies you've been working with in the cohort. So it's fantastic to have you as a partner. John Perez, would you tell us a little bit about your work and yourself?
That sounds great. And likewise, thanks so much, Diane, and for MedTech Innovator for having me. Just really excited to be here, and hopefully the folks listening in find some value out of this. So John Perez, I'm the managing director of Ballot Ventures. So I have a little bit of a long-winded career that I won't dig into, but I started off as a biomedical engineer. I've spent a couple of different stints in digital healthcare, healthcare IT, and similarly have wound up somewhere in the venture capital space. And so again, pleasure to be the managing director of Ballad Ventures. We're the corporate venture fund for Ballad Health. Ballad Health is a 21 hospital system based in Eastern Tennessee, Western Virginia. And so we have a little bit of Kentucky, a little bit of North Carolina, but large catchment area, a large number of hospitals, and probably around a $2 billion health system. So small to medium sized system, but again, pretty rural in our geography. And we typically lean in to that mentality and really think about our digital innovation and venture activities associated with being a rural healthcare provider in the US. And so from a ventures perspective, we're a small shop, but we make direct investments. We also make some LP investments into the digital healthcare space. We do some medical devices. We won't touch pharmacy or a couple of the other tangential spaces just because of our check size. We're about $1 million check size, give or take, and just shy of where, Abby, you were kind of mentioning in the seed to B range. I think most on the line get that the letters don't really mean much anymore. And so trying to figure, some of those pieces out. But I'd say, we're not typically not the first logo on the slide from a strategic investor, but, second to 10 logo is right in our sweet spot. So if that gives a better sense of context. And so from that, just again, grateful to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
June, John, last certainly not least, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Of course. First off, Diane and everyone else here, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part. I think MTI is truly one of the kind organization in this space, and specifically the device and tools. Conferences are usually really well run, and I promise I'm not being paid to say this, but yeah, it's been
Checks in the mail.
But excited to be here. As for me, my name is June, principal at Coastal Ventures, medical doctor by training, about a decade of basic and clinical science research in areas like microfluidics, immuno-oncology, and rare disease. Before joining KV, brief stints at few digital health and biotech startups, founded and ran a biotech and a digital health accelerator in Philly, where I became sort of really infatuated with the idea of disruption and startups and the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Most recently, dabbled in incubations and investing at AliCorp right before joining Coastal. And I've been at Coastal Ventures since 2021. Just for everyone else to know about Coastal Ventures, founded in 2004 by all too legendary Mr. Vinod Khosla. AUM is now at about 15 billion. It's basically a large institutional investor in the Bay Area. But I'm happy to talk about our secret sauce. So we tend to invest in rounds. Well, this is not really a secret sauce, but for our check size, we invest in sort of round as small as a few $100K and as large as a few $100 million. Definitely no more than that, because we think that's too much capital. That's deployed across 3 different funds that cater to different sizes. Giving the first check into bold and usually impactful ideas has been sort of our bread and butter. Examples of that include our first institutional checks into companies like OpenAI, Block, which formerly called Square, Ultima Genomics, Instacart, which is very relevant for this week as they prepared for IPO. In terms of sectors, nothing is really off limits. We can go as deep tech as rockets and cold fusion, which was the case for Rocket Labs and Commonwealth Fusion, and as consumery as Instacart, Affirm, DoorDash, what have you. But healthcare is where I spend my time, and happy to dive more into that later. And thanks again for the invite, and I'll pass it back over to Diane.
Fantastic, really appreciate that. You all 3 of you have given me a flavor of what you invest in. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on what makes a compelling investment. Everybody, all 3 of you have lots of opportunities or lots of really interesting startups come your way. Would you have an example? What makes what are the things that you are looking for in a compelling startup, in a first contact? And perhaps I'll start with Abby, because I got started with her, and I promise, Abby, I will not always start with you.
I'm going to hold you to that, Diane. But I'll give one, and I'll let the gents add another characteristic. But I think the number one characteristic that all VCs look for, no matter what, is people, right? The first thing and foremost, the reason why we say we invest in the passionate founders who are looking to revolutionize medical solutions is because it's about team and it's about the people. Technologies don't build themselves, devices don't build themselves, products don't build themselves, they don't sell themselves, right? It really is all about the people. And so the most compelling thing for me, the characteristic that I look at first and foremost, is the team. I'm going to pass the baton over to John.
We'll just keep following in order, but we're gonna have to. No, that's fantastic. And Abby, just to add to that, again, we're a corporate venture fund. I think everyone in this room and really excited to be here because I think I'm going to learn, more from Abby and June than I will for myself, obviously. But excited to unpack some of these strategies as a corporate venture fund. Our biggest characteristic of something that's intriguing to us is it has to tie to our strategic mission and vision as an organization, right? So we're a health system, and most of the investments we make need to be aligned with, are you solving a core problem for strategic health systems across the country? And so I'll unpack that and give a little bit more flavor of our kind of, I guess, thesis and strategy as we think about it. We don't have to add a customer contract in place in order to invest, but we do need line of sight into the fact that this is going to be valuable to us and in the ecosystem at large in our kind of size and shape. So the way I think about it, and I actually stole this from another friend, colleague, corporate venture fund, but you think about it as kind of this 3-ring bullseye. In the first ring, 50% of our investments, we should be a current customer. We are a current customer, and really we see the value of the product, and we're looking to add capital to help, grow and shape this organization. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two would be, okay, let's call it maybe 40%. The second tranche of the bullseye is, we're not a current customer, but, we have line of sight in the fact that we would be. Maybe timing's not working out, maybe budget's not working out, but this is something that's solving a core problem for health system providers across the country. And so we see that our core operators believe that, and so we can kind of make that investment. And then the outer ring is really just flexibility to invest in what's coming around the corner. Like we don't know what we don't know, and strategic investments can be really valuable for understanding new spaces. And so we kind of reserve that, maybe that 10% outer ring, to think about, okay, maybe we're not going to be a current customer, doesn't fit our profile, but we're really interested in this space. We want to infuse the innovation and ideas of this industry into our organism. And so that's how we think about the world. So from that perspective, to kind of bring it back and tie it up is just a strong strategic tie to the mission and vision of the organization.
I'll go next. So this is a tough one, but it's an important one for a large institutional investing into early stage companies. And we do spend a fair amount of time internally just talking about some of these very ideas. And I'll happy to give some examples as well to sort of illustrate my points. The examples are from recent deals is pretty tough because a lot of them haven't been released yet, but from the ones that have been announced, both on the device and the tools space, I'll start with the company that's developing Bionaut, which is a company that's developing sort of a millimeter scale traveling implant that can be magnetically controlled from outside the body to deliver precise amount of drugs into very hard to reach places in the body and retrieve it right back out after delivering the payload. Sounds like science fiction, right? And you really wouldn't believe the demos that they show. And they're well on track. Michael, who is the CEO there, is an Israeli entrepreneur who had a good tech exit background, who's just really laser focused on both the R&D and how to thread that careful needle of taking a sophisticated technology into the right business model and the right market. So we've been very impressed by him from the early stages, and this is all in addition to of course, clear tech differentiation and a large market, which in this case was the drug delivery and sort of the biologics market. And what made us, and sort of the three package was sort of, for this case, made us gain enough conviction to invest. That's on the device side. And Bionaut, I would say, is more on the science fiction spectrum, whereas on the other side is more bread and butter on the device side, which we don't typically delve in a lot into. So if that gives some flavor as to what kind of things we get excited about. In the tools space, we invested early into a company called Seleno and then followed on with big checks last year, which is creating a fully automated system for stem cell culturing and differentiation by solving sort of key hurdles in that process through the marriage of biology and physics, which oftentimes very hard things to come together. The seed bet came down really to just a few things, but you'll see a theme here. One, it was a clearly differentiated piece of technology that was a step function better than the status quo of that process, and the big regenerative medicine market opportunity, which we saw. But most importantly, and this goes into Abby's point about the entrepreneur, the investment really came down to investing into this brilliant and charismatic Bangladeshi woman who completed her PhD at Harvard and was using this technology in her thesis. It's proven out that she's been hiring exceptionally well, and I think that has really made all the difference. Hopefully from the three of us, for those of us listening, we're hopefully catching the theme in a sense of the differentiated tech market as a prerequisite while indexing on the strength of the founding team and various other considerations on the CVC side, which I'm just now learning more about, which is amazing.
That is fantastic. I really appreciate you kind of diving in there. And so with that, even seeing the different and sometimes similar things that you're paying attention to, I often tend to ask, what's the door to entry? And so perhaps what are things to consider when approaching you, specifically your firm, given that you invest in different things, that you look at different considerations. This time, I think I'll just because June, you've been one, you've always been last. So
I can go.
I'm staying with you. What are some specific considerations when approaching you? And I'll use you also more as the archetype of VC versus CVC, which is where the other two panelists play. So what are the unique considerations?
I'm happy to go a little bit deeper on this one, past the one-on-one level here. Hopefully that will be helpful, both for early stage and later stage startups. So the question touches on a few important elements, and that not even in the field of venture capital. So outside of CVCs, so we think of VCs, and the theory here that I'm trying to convey is that not all investors, and even in that realm, are playing the same game, so to speak. And there are many considerations for that, which we won't delve too much into. But as a general rule, institutional investors with large AUM will tend to focus on really high upside markets with a team that they can trust early on. So for these large institutions, it's about shots on goal as we think about it with high conviction. But that's just like a general rule. But happy to delve into us specifically as well. At Khosla, we tend to seriously mean it when we say we are tech focused, even when all things point the other way all the time, and that we are very much impact driven. So bold and being impactful are some of our core themes here. So we invested, for example, we invested into a company called Garden Health almost 10 years ago now, when liquid biopsy wasn't even a real thing. Very early, we believed in the technology, we believed in the team, and the big paradigm shift in the cancer screening market, that it would have impact on everyone. And so that was the bold bet that we made early on. And another one is we invested into a company that's creating a life-sustaining incubator for sick infants, because of course the market and all that stuff was there, but it was one that we knew there would be enormous impact that would follow the child and the mother for the rest of their lives. And let's face it, we're all investors at the end of the day and look for returns, but our commitment, perhaps with some fellow investors in this sort of category of VCs as well, commitment to being bold and impactful is sort of what gets me up every morning. And proud to say that. diving into sort of that VC archetype again. So what early stage tend to look for are more vision and team focused with an interesting technology. As you get later and later stage, whether you're talking to a primary software based investors versus a med tech investors, even they will have different sort of goal mandates and team expertise to handle those transactions. So pure device investors, which we're seeing unfortunately fewer and fewer these days, have specific sort of return profiles that they're comfortable with and they've repeated many times, whereas that would not be true at all for those who primarily focus on softwares, and they tend to shy away from this other side. And it's really not about the company sometimes. I think for med tech companies, the additional layer of struggle is not only finding the firms that have capital to invest, but also want to invest in the medtech market and have the expertise to see that through. I think that adds additional layer of complexity, which adds to more of the homework the founders need to do prior to going out to investors.
I'll come back to the type of homework that you would like people to do in a little bit. But I'd love to hear, John, you mentioned mission, right? And so my assumption is that your answer to like, what are the unique things to consider here revolves around that. Perhaps dive a little bit deeper. When is it worth both your time, yours and the entrepreneurs, to have that conversation?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm the middle child, so I can be the middle panelist at the moment. And June, I think what I learned, and again, I think is spot on, is from what you just shared, is know who you're talking to, right? Which is kind of the core of this question, is know who is behind the other end of the table and understand kind of their incentives and their challenges. And so, I already talked about the strategic tie into the organization, and so I don't need to kind of belabor that point. I think one other piece when at least approaching provider funds specifically, or folks in kind of my same camp, is timing actually ends up being the biggest sticky point. I'm sure it might shock you, maybe not, but we cannot take a look at an investment and invest in 3 weeks. It doesn't happen. There are a lot of institutional investors that can move quickly and they can move fast, but the way we think about the world is we need to align that idea, solution, founder with our strategy. And in order to do that, it just takes time. So typically for us and most of my, provider colleagues across the country, we know companies for 6+ months before we write a check. There's no company we're getting introduced to and we don't know for that long amount of time before we're making an investment. And so what it means is, don't come to the conversation and always be closing, because even if you're the next OpenAI, right, and you're closing in 3 weeks and it's oversubscribed, there's nothing we can do. We just don't work that way. And so instead, right, coming into the conversation, being open, curious about the idea, the problem you're trying to solve, and what relationship you're trying to establish with the provider fund is wildly more successful in having conversations with those provider institutional funds or provider strategic funds than would be, timing. So that's one just item to consider. Again, would double click on what June you said, and additionally kind of that strategic tie, but that's one that just seems to kind of come out hidden, I guess.
I mean, Olympus is kind of a household name to folks in the medtech sector. So there may be preconceived notions as in, all right, if I have an imaging technology, I should go to Olympus. And so is that right? And just to follow up on the two others, any additional considerations there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like both June and John's points are really solid, right? That there is strategic fit for everybody, even institutional investors. We're all to some degree thesis driven, right? And we're all content producers. And so you can pretty much go ahead, look online and figure out what people are interested in investing in today, right? So from like a homework perspective, and I know we're going to get back to it, I think that that's like one of the main things is that you can go to any of our websites and you can see exactly what it is that we're interested in investing in today. Okay. Imaging for Olympus, to your point, yes, it is interesting, but which version of imaging, because if it's MRI or CT imaging, it's not me. I'm a photo and video company, right? Like endoscopes are essentially video companies, right? And so I think that like really understanding who you're approaching, and we can talk about how to do the homework to figure out who you're approaching, is one part of it. And I think the other part of it is knowing exactly what it is that you need, right? So while you can go out there and you can try to look up all of these investors and put them all down on a list and whatnot, the way that you prioritize them or figure out what it is that you should be looking for or talking to these people about is by figuring out what you need over the next 24 months. So if you're raising for a 24 to 36 month timeline in today's world, right? Being truly honest with yourselves about where you have gaps that investors and advisors could potentially fill is an imperative part of the question to consider when you're going out to approach an investor. Because undoubtedly, especially when you're talking to a strategic like ourselves, but this is true with all investors, right? Is that we're essentially doing risk analysis on a company in order to gain conviction in them, to June's point, right? And where we see risk that we can uniquely gap or mitigate is the value that we see ourselves bringing to that company. And so when you look at your own company and you say, okay, well, here are my gaps, here are the unmet needs that I have that I think I should be able to get from investors or advisors, then it makes a heck of a better conversation when you're going in, having done all of your homework, to talk to an investor about what this round looks like and what you would need them to bring to the table and what you're going to do in order to prove yourself successful with this round of funding.
Appreciate that. Diving a little bit deeper into the tactics, one of the questions I often get from our startups is as simple as, do corporate venture funds ever lead, or do I need a separate lead investor and then convince a strategic later? So John, not a middle child, or a middle child, but not necessarily for these purposes. Do you lead?
Yeah, I asked for that one, didn't I? No, we don't. And so we'll fit into that camp. What I'd say more from a macro perspective is we absolutely invest alongside other corporate venture fund leads. So it's not that CVCs across the board don't. It's just that given our check size and the stage we play, it really doesn't make a ton of sense. And instead, we'd rather lean in where we know we can provide the most value, which is that strategic customer alignment, customer fit, et cetera. And so not that that's a one size fits all, but that's where kind of we play at Ballot. But I'm sure Abby and June have different perspectives.
Yeah,
Abby,
I mean, I think for sure we can lead, right? We've got no rules against it. And I think that's probably true for a lot of CVCs. They might have, a general condition where they don't like to lead, but they always can. I think it also can communicate something to outside players if you have a CVC leading an early round, right? And so I think that those are all considerations that you can have for yourself too, is like, what I want a CVC as a leader at this point in time. What would that mean for me? What kind of signal does that give to the outside world, right? Or would I want them to come in as a non-lead? And so I think that that's the main thing here, is because having a CVC on your cap table, either as a lead or as a follow-on, can be a signal of how the industry is viewing you and of really the revolutionary power that you hold as a startup company. And so I think it's less about if they lead or not, because I think they probably always will if the opportunity is squarely enough within the strategic fit. But is that something that you want?
In our like preparation for going live on this call, we talked about the current funding climate, and in many ways we expect entrepreneurs to be scrappy and to and pretty much to raise funds whichever way they can. And so historically you would have a VC come in and then you would try and syndicate the round with CVCs, with other VCs. I'm hearing from folks that we're seeing broader syndication, right? With family offices, high net worth individuals, angel groups, a type of a blended round. How much of that do you see? June, I'll ask you, just sure, because you're probably often asked to lead, and my assumption is that you do lead quite most or many of your rounds. Let me ask you as well.
Oh yeah, I mean this is an easy question for us, and the answer is yes. And it sort of, if you look at the economics, it has to be a certain way. Their allocations really matter to us as we think about scaling a fund. Um, in terms of, but obviously that's for the first check, and it's case by case in terms of how often we lead rounds on the subsequent rounds. But the first one, we definitely want to take as much of the round, but also save some room for value-added syndicates. And the topic of the syndicate itself, and I think this is a very keen observation you've sort of pointed out, Diane. And in the last 5 years, the industry as a whole have been seeing more and more family offices and high net worth individuals coming into the venture capital scene, and we're certainly seeing more of them on the cap table as we even go to invest on the seed rounds, which we thought were early, but they have their whole strategy of getting really amazing founders to align with the missions even earlier on and provide them that check. And when you think about Apple, they had their angel investor moments as well early on from some of these high net worth individuals. And actually, many venture capital firms, like a fully functioning, really well-run firms, are beginning to be created with these high net worth individuals as single or majority LPs. And I'd probably even say most tech billionaires will have some form of this. Examples are like Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt, both have multiple funds, brands of funds this way, and are super savvy too. And when we invest, we want to make sure we're syndicating with the right value add partners, as I mentioned. And I think as family offices continue to evolve, we're seeing more value add, such as connections for commercial and expert review and diligence. I think to top it off, one theory for this movement is, I think it in part is the macro, but also looking at the asset class itself and what they are looking for, and they tend to be more longer term investment horizon, and and the asset class here is a good wealth mechanism for them, is what they are starting to recognize. And so they're placing bets early on and holding them for a long time. It's a generational wealth mechanism for them. And so, yeah, and it's a great way to diversify portfolio during uncertain times because of that long-term horizon. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts. And I'll hand it over to you, Diane.
Great. I appreciate that. And I also want to make sure that the other panelists, you should always feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, well, Diane, maybe just one comment from my end is it is really interesting. I mean, we typically actually do follow that more standardized structure where we love an institutional lead and we love to have a couple, brand name logos from a strategic perspective to fill out the round. Like that's we still think those are some of the market makers, and we kind of lean into that, and we help bring along some of the other, especially in our world, which is provider first, bring a couple other logos to into the mix, because if we have that problem, we're hoping that others have that problem. That alone is kind of tests out the market, right, and does a lot of your diligence for you. So I would say we absolutely fit in that camp. I've also seen some really interesting things come into play. I mean, we've seen some crowdsourcing raises where it's a Series A for 5 million and they do a 25K checkup across a blanket board. There's pros and cons with all of it, but it's just interesting to see the vehicles that are coming up these days and kind of how, I think the point is well taken, June, that you mentioned, is that effectively this is a long-term partnership, regardless of who it is. And you have to know who it is that you're bringing onto your cap table. And you have to be ready to be with those individuals for the next 5-10 years at a minimum. And so understanding whether it's a family office, whether it's a corporate fund, whether it's an institutional fund, if you're not aligned in whatever it is you need to be aligned on, it's going to be challenging. And if you are, it can be really powerful across it's like the whole Adam or idiom of, culture eats strategy for lunch every day. I mean, that's true for the company. That's also true for the investors and the board that you put around you, right? The culture around that table can be really, really helpful, especially as kind of things in the market make waves. You're going to go through challenging times. And if you can bring the right folks around the table, it's going to be really, really beneficial to you. I
mean, just like tagging onto that, a great syndicate can make or break a company. Because a good piece of advice at the right time is worth its weight in gold, right? And it's funny because we were just talking, just got off a call talking with a team where we were talking about it's really important to know who the other co-investors are, right? Because we want to understand, again, to my point about what are you missing? What do you need? What do they bring to the table? How does it complement what I can bring to the table in order to build out this whole piece? So, if I'm talking to, a biotech company that works with imaging devices, for example, and they've got a biotech venture fund on the cap table who I know can help them bridge that need and that advice when they need it. And I can bring in the imaging expertise, right? That's powerful stuff, right? I know they've got the right people around the table. And so I think that whether that comes from a family office or a high net worth individual or an institutional VC or a CVC, like it doesn't matter, right? Like when you're all aligned for the interest of the company.
I appreciate that perspective. Going a little bit more deeper into tactics. The other conversation that pretty much always comes up with startups is valuation. It's an art and a science. One can have endless discussions about it, and we sure could. That leads to an immediate question for what are comparable deals? How do I figure out what my company should be worth? And so I'd be curious if you have tips and tricks as to good sources of information to help companies come up with an accurate valuation. And I'll leave that up to either of you. You get to say pass. I've got a fun question from our LinkedIn audience as well.
Well, maybe just one comment on it. It's hard to answer that in a generic way. And I think all of us around the table are probably struggling because every deal is so different. There is no, answer sheet that's out there that you just have to find. It's who's comparable to you as an organization, right? It's not just med device in one camp and you can use 5x revenue. That's not how you have to think about it. Instead, it's what are the individual companies or examples out there that are comparable to you? That's really hard. And most entrepreneurs, for better or for worse, will say, oh, we're a unicorn. We're kind of on our own from a competitive landscape perspective, right? Then how do you think about evaluating yourself from what exits have happened in the past? And so maybe not an answer, but more of a general comment is that, you have to do the work to understand who's surrounding you that you're comparable to, and then think about what is that trajectory that they went and can we follow a similar trajectory? And then you can kind of backtrack into the financials along the way.
Yeah, I completely agree, John. And I wholeheartedly agree that it's very, very context dependent. And it's a hard question for early stage investors. For us, we look at our investment strategy as sort of an option investing for the big bets later on as well. And early bets, so if you assume a company will be as big as Google, does it really matter what the little negotiations in terms of plus or minus single digit percentages or even double digit percentages, does that really make sense and argue over valuations early stage? Not really, but we don't tend to chase valuations. We want to make sure we are making sure we're aligned with the founders about realistic valuations. Not really getting hung up on the hype cycle is very important as well as you think about subsequent rounds. For practical purposes, though, for early stage, I think Carta does regularly publish sort of what an average valuation is very an aggregate data, so it might not be super useful, but it's a good starting point if you don't have any number to go off of. But I want to make sure I stress an important point that I've learned from our team internally is that it's if you look into the first principle, it's about how much money you need and how much dilution you want to take at that very first stage. And think about, in order to minimize the dilution for yourself as a founder, it's often not the best strategy to raise too much and to promise too big. we oftentimes see the best strategy working out for both the founders and inside investors is to raise capital at the right dilution and the capital need based on exactly the right value inflection milestone you will have. And that's something your syndicate and your investment partners will help you think about as we look at what are we looking for at this stage, and what do we consider as a true value inflection. And those are some of the important discussions you should definitely be having at early stages before you go out and raise, and as you think about essentially how much dilution you want to take.
I'll just jump in again because I can't double click on that enough. I mean, it is, and you're seeing a lot of the challenges of the past couple of years having impacted folks who have taken on too much money and too much capital and not kind of thought through the strategy, especially with, you know, first-time entrepreneurs who see kind of a valuation. They're like, yes, let's go after it. That's not always the right move. It's the next step and the next step after that. I mean, even just today, if you all follow along CB Insights, you know, the article was, what was it? It was talking about this specifically. It was the last time healthcare AI went boom, and AI is changing everything, again. And it highlighted two companies as Babylon and Olive in their fundraising cycles. And, you know, again, you're just seeing these massive raises, and that's fine if you have the growth to support it. But if you don't, you're going to get hit with a challenging tailwind. And I think that is just can't reemphasize that, June, enough, is think about what you need and then take only what you need, because otherwise, you know, you'll be chasing your tail.
Appreciate that. With the dilution question, pretty much automatically comes the control question, and we've got a question from LinkedIn, from Shamal, who is a prior CVC on control, specifically the control you seek as a CVC investor versus a venture capitalist investor. So basically the amount of control you might be seeking with an investment. And cohort, we'll get to the cohort questions when we get into Q&A in about 15 minutes. But I appreciate folks posting questions on LinkedIn and YouTube. So control. Who wants to take that one?
I can start with that one, because it was one of the main things that I was thinking about as June and John were talking, which is that sometimes it's not about valuation as much as it is about equity percentage. Right. And so in that equity percentage is control, right? Like getting back to the question. And so I think that it differs all the time based on every single fund, not just between institutional and CVC. Institutional, in my perspective, having been in that world, almost every institutional VC has an equity percentage that they're looking for. CVC, at least we don't. Right? Like we don't have an equity target that we're looking for with our check size, but that can change depending on which CVC you're talking to, right? And I think the only way that you start to understand whether somebody has a target or not is if you ask them, right? So in your first conversation with them, if this isn't something that's published online, and nearly all of our stats are all published online about what we're looking for, right? You can just ask them, do you have any equity targets? How much ownership do you like to take in a company? Right? Because every single one is different. Some CVCs won't invest without a ROFR, right? Some only want info rights. Some don't want, you know, anything at all except for an equity stake. And so it just, again, it depends on what you need to prioritize and what you're looking for. And the only way that you can know is to ask.
Those are great points, Abby. And just to add a quick bits from the institutional side, one thing is we do tend to be wary of is the ROFO, not so much the ROFR, but in terms of if a big CVC comes into wants to come into a round of a very promising startup on our end, it'll be an interesting conversation as we think about that, and we do see that as not negative necessarily, but it is a show of conviction in the space for sure. It's a good signal, but it doesn't necessarily align with the mission of the firm in terms of how we think about return profile. The allocation target we tend to look for in our bets typically are double digit percentages. And that's not just an arbitrary number in a sense that we really gauge how we allocate our operating partner resources and their time into how much ownership we have. So we can't be sending a company, an operating partner on commercial device strategies or product all in their own time to work on a portfolio company when we hold 1% or one that we know is going through an acquisition or something like that. So we want to be very conscious of some of these terms as dictated by who's controlling the board and et cetera, but also making sure we have enough of an allocation for us to justify our internal resource allocation.
Perhaps, Abby, you teed it up for me in terms of potentially uncomfortable questions to ask, right? Just like, are you seeking or what type of equity position are you seeking? So is it important for a startup to know how much money is left in your current fund? Do you have funding to deploy? Is that a question that one gets asked, and I recognize that's less of a question for the CVCs, more a question for institutional investors, and but how should a startup approach that? And June, you're probably not being asked that very frequently, so you can potentially just answer this as a placeholder. How should a startup go about finding out how much dry powder a firm has before approaching them?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking back to my days, maybe 1 or 2 out of 10 times I would be asked. But what that tells me is that they haven't done the homework, right? So there are numerous ways to sort of get a feel for how much dry powder, or the magnitude of, at least, it's not exactly how many shots on goal they have left, but can get a sense of how they've progressed and were they able to subsequently raise rounds and etc. But I think there are ways to ask that doesn't show that you haven't done the homework for the firm. But not to maybe directly ask, as if I would sort of tie in with some of the elements about the firm, and just curious if you guys are thinking of like how you guys are thinking about allocation strategies. It's like a sort of a very much a side question, but also a very important one for you, because it's a private data that is not super available outside of the firm. So but you don't want to approach it too directly, because that might show that you haven't done the homework. But that's just I don't know if that's helpful.
June,
but
could I ask you, so like, would you, the way that I'm thinking about it is like, if a founder came to you and said like, hey, I saw that you've made these 3 investments already this year, like how many more are you thinking about making before year end? That's
a good one. Wow. Okay, so you framed it really naturally there. I think
and so you wouldn't feel offended by it. You'd be like, all right, good, that like they know like the right questions to ask.
Yeah, I don't think it's I think for sure that's the right direction. For me, it's less about, it's definitely more about how much work are they putting into this fundraise. And if you think about it from a fundamental level, you got to really know the audience. And I feel really disappointed sometimes if it just feels like a firm is just one of the firms in their 100 firm checklist. Every firm wants to naturally want to feel special. That's like human nature, right? Even as a startup, as a fund going in, talking to startups, you want to make sure the founders feel special, the company special. And then that's the same way for the firms as well, I would say, just, I guess, human nature.
Well, and that goes, Abby, into doing your homework, right? Which June, you just like kind of capitalized on, right? It's doing your homework, knowing that they just raised, and whether they just raised the round or they just invested in these 3 companies, like every single one of us probably have a press release on every single raise that we've
Yeah.
done.
Oh yeah.
And it's not that hard to Google Ballot Ventures and see what are the last 3 companies that we've invested in. Is it frequent? Is it not frequent like that? But a lot of folks don't do that. And I mean, to your point, June, it's kind of like a customer funnel, right? It's 100-person funnel, but that doesn't mean you don't have to do the homework to make Ballot Health feel very special when you have customer conversations about us and know your homework is the same conversation with investors. And a simple Google search will tell you so much. It blows my mind. And it's just out there. And there's a lot of ways to feel like you can ask the question, Abby, the way you astutely did is, oh, you've raised these 3. How many more are you raising that round? Like that's going to come off way better than how much do you have any money? Do you have any money to invest? Which I can't imagine would sit with anyone.
I asked
And
it
is this a
very
good-
harshly. Go ahead, Abby.
No, is this a good point to talk about doing your homework?
Yes, please. Did you read my mind? Yes.
Well,
What
good, so-
other ways of homework should one do? So Google, absolutely. Should I also call up one of your previous investments, or is that deeper into the diligence? So should I call up a startup you've invested in? Do people do that? What other types of homework are we talking about? Abby, you go first. You teed it up.
Okay. I mean, I think the very basics, like I said, go on the website. What stage, what focus areas, what check size, do they lead, do they not lead? LinkedIn the partners to figure out who's the best leading partner for you, right? Basics. Takes you all of maybe 10 minutes to go find out all of this information. And if you have that for every single one of your investors, it should be part of your pipeline chart. To John's point, just like your sales pipeline, all of these are indicators on there that can help you prioritize who to reach out to when, right? And then I think on top of that, right, like as I mentioned just at that last bit, the partner counts. All partners within a firm are not created equal. All associates are not created equal. They don't all look at the same thing. Like June was saying, right? Like he focuses on healthcare. If he reached out to one of his colleagues, right, and his colleague didn't know how to gauge it and didn't think it was interesting, you might never get looked at by the right person, right? So know who the right person is to reach out to. And then that part of that homework too is figure out how to get in touch with them, whether that's a warm introduction, if you can manage it. I know that's a lot harder said than done, but you're part of MTI or you're listening to MTI. They have tons of connections, right? There's tons of other companies that have connections to them too. Like there's ways to find that. And so I definitely would say like the warmer the intro, the better that you can get if possible. If not, then you've got a little bit more homework to do, which is like listen to a podcast that they've been on, rewatch one of the live shows that they've chatted on, or whatever else it is, right? To figure out one thing that they said that was really interesting and then write a solid cold email that is actually personalized, that is actually thoughtful. And because I swear to you, in the half an hour that maybe it takes you to write that personalized cold email, yeah, sure, you could have sent 100 non-personalized cold emails, but one good one is actually going to get you a response versus maybe one out of the 100 that you sent without. And so that would be my first big thing on homework.
100%. I mean, and I parallel it to, because I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's spot on. Like if you pull out a quote from a podcast I've done, I'm taking your call. Guaranteed. I think it just shows that you've done your work, and it's hard to do that, right? It takes time, but it does, show a lot. On the other end, I would parallel it to the homework that we all around the table do on you as a company, right? Everything you just mentioned, Abby, is what I do when I'm starting to dig down deeper of a company conversation. I'll look at who's invested in that company. Do I have any connections? Can I start to back channel? Do I look at the LinkedIn of the CEO? Do I know, what experience they have? Like, it's not different. It's very similar, and it takes a few minutes. But when there's kind of the low level of homework that you need to do to just feel comfortable with the conversation. Then if conversations go well, then you can start, Diane, to your point, doing some of the back channeling of potential. Like if you're having an intro call with me, I highly don't suggest reaching out to a portfolio company of ours and having a conversation. That's a little early. But if we're down the rabbit hole, I think that's fantastic. That shows you're doing your homework too. Which is great. And tangential to this, but maybe just a point that I think is worth mentioning on homework. Be careful what you put out there because of the homework that the other individual ends up doing. I can't tell you how many times, folks, especially in healthcare, the provider network is not very big. right? It's very small. And if you think about like CVCs in the provider world, there's maybe 50 of us across the country, and we all kind of know each other. It's a very small group. And so when you put a logo on your slide from a customer perspective, and I know that individual, you better bet that I'm going to call that individual and say, hey, what's the relationship with them? So you say, hey, enterprise contract. Funny anecdote. I was at a conference this week, and I was talking with another provider fund here in my network, and he mentioned that the company that had just pitched them a couple of days ago had their own logo on the slide that he was pitching to the investment fund. They had the health system logo on their slide. And he was questioning, what's that? Oh, you're in our funnel, right? Like you're in our funnel. And so boom, immediate, you've just lost all credibility in that. And so maybe a very sharp example of it, but if you can't really have conviction that the customers that you're touting on your logo slide really do, have faith in the partnership, just know that we're going to back channel and do our own homework. And I'd rather have that transparent conversation up front than kind of get caught, if you will, on the back end, and it never leads to a positive relationship after that.
That's a really good point, and that's such an interesting story, and that's probably a nightmare. One of the nightmare stories that one could possibly conjure up is right for a founder. But touching on that homework on our side, for the founders listening, I want to emphasize that we are also doing homework on our end. So you better be doing your homework as well, right? The work that I do is I look at the founders' LinkedIn profiles. I would check out some of the posts that they put out, or any of the relevant articles on Google. I would definitely skim through the pitch. I can't read every slide. I like listening to the founder tell their story, but I definitely try to get a sense of the company. And that all takes, I would say 5 minutes. But there are a lot of meetings, right? But I want to make sure that I know the founders are juggling a lot of investor relationship in their funnel. But I want to make sure that we all understand that on our side, our job function is also to meet a funnel of startups on our side. So it's really awesome to see if there's a mutual engagement in that sort of effort. It just proves how committed you are to the process.
One of the things I've seen recently, it was pretty cool, was a 5-minute video where the founder was doing their pitch on the video. So when it was like where you'd send your deck, instead of just sending the deck for me to look through, it was the 5-minute video. So short and sweet, but I got your actual narration to it. And I was like, oh, this is solid. So
Amazing.
highly recommend that to founders.
I'll give you a fun one. So my former role prior to this was with Avia, and if you're familiar with Avia, it's a digital healthcare consultancy. But the punchline is it's about 50 health systems across the country that pay Avia to vet digital technologies and align them with their partners that would really align with their strategy. And my role, I had the benefit of being able to create Avia's venture network, which was a subset of Avia's network, about 12 dozen providers that have funds that also look to invest alongside the customer relationships that they build with these companies. So I kind of created this mini Shark Tank, and Diane, that's how we know each other, which is always fun to bring back the memories. But the best example of a company, so maybe 50 companies a year would come pitch to this provider group, and they'd ask questions. You'd have 15 minutes to pitch. So funny you say that in the video. The number one success story was an entity where the CEO ended up just in person, in live event, sharing the video for 2 to 3 minutes and said, I have 15 minutes. I want to answer your questions. I'm not going to pitch to you. Here's the video, go. And it's completely, controversial. I would have never guided that individual to do it, but they were the most successful company that came through the program because, he knew this is the exact pitch. And so sometimes the modality of how you get the message across is arguably the most important. And so it's just funny to see those examples of things that play out. Yeah. So I'll similarly look at a podcast. If I can find a podcast of the CEO that's articulating their perspective, that's the best for me.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, and just as a note to founders, all the founders listening in, put it on, if it's your deck, put it on DocSend, if it's YouTube, right? Because then, as also part of your homework, you can see if that venture capitalist actually watched your presentation, read it, how far they went through it, how long they spent on it. Then how much time you have to spend educating them on your actual product.
And I think this also segues into some of the the questions that was on the bank about, what are some materials like are relevant other than perhaps a pitch deck. I guess the controversial take for me personally is that I love reading pitch decks. I mean, like I could read hundreds a day, and I think I'm just like a very much a visual learner. So it always helps to have nice pictures and images and figures incorporated. I feel as though I am less willing to spend time to see a video unless it's a very complicated technology where I've seen one of our portfolio companies pull off really well, where it's like I think it's like the most complex medical device I've ever seen. I would not have really comprehended it unless there was like a full demo or a computer graphics illustrated sort of an animation form of it. I thought that was really helpful to demo the product. In terms of the pitch, I love hearing it live. So in terms of the best weapon a founder can come in to a pitch meeting with is that PDF of the deck and the appropriate audiovisual equipment to display the pitch and to just really run with how you tell the story. I love seeing how they sort of frame the market, frame the opportunity, frame their business model, frame the product. That's all goes into our initial first point about what do we look for in a company, which is the quality of the team and perhaps the CEO. And one of the most important attributes of a CEO is to be able to tell the story, to raise the capital, as I think a big component of CEO's job is to raise capital, and then it all goes into telling the story and telling it live helps us clue into how you're going to sell to a live client on that table. And I think that's an extraordinary variable that we look for.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Diane. I think we're about that time.
Time has flown. I could.
Oh no! Wow, it's already.
I could keep this up for hours, but I don't want to be respectful to your time. This is where we bid our online audience goodbye. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. Next week, we'll talk about manufacturing and supply chain. Please join us again. But with that, I really want to extend my heartfelt thanks to our three panelists today. It's been phenomenal. Please stay on for Q&A with the cohort only while we end the live stream. Folks on LinkedIn and YouTube, have a great day.